What happened that made the shy kid finally stand up for themselves? My foster nephew Chang was taken in by my brother and sister-in-law purely because he was a genetic match with their 9-year-old Charlie. Charlie had a rare form of cancer, and as his way of saying thank you, Chang stepped up to help save Charlie's life. For 2 years, Chang donated plasma blood and platelets weekly, had his thigh skin grafted from his body every month, and gave parts of his liver as often as he could. By 11, he was balding with his teeth falling out. Doctors warned he might not hit puberty till late teenage years, and he couldn't go to school without being bullied for looking like a freak. But Chang didn't care. All he wanted was a family. He'd been in foster care since he was 4, bounced between 7 homes. This was the first place where someone said, "We need you." So when my brother promised adoption papers once Charlie hit remission, Chang was the happiest he'd ever been. 2 weeks before the adoption, he came to Samuel and Rebecca with just one request. I wrote letters to my birth parents to tell them I'm finally getting adopted. His voice cracked. Could we stop by the cemetery on the way to the courthouse? Just for 5 minutes? I want to tell them I have a family now and leave the letters at their graves. Rebecca looked up from her laptop. Of course we'll stop, Chang. That's really sweet. Samuel nodded. Wouldn't miss it, buddy. Family's important. Chang's whole face lit up. Really? You promise? We promise, they both said. The night before adoption day, Chang couldn't sleep. He kept getting up to check the flowers he planned to set at the grave. He ironed his one good shirt 4 times despite being so weak he could barely hold the iron. Even tried to polish his shoes but stopped when he couldn't bend over from the back pain. Yet still, Chang was happier than ever. Until 8:15 in the morning when the doorbell rang. Rebecca opened the door, and in walked this blonde woman came with a new boy who looked about Chang's age. This boy was white, and unlike Chang, he looked healthy. This is Nelson, Rebecca announced. He's joining us for the courthouse trip. Chang smiled nervously. Is he another foster kid getting adopted today? Something like that, Samuel said. Let's get going. Don't want to be late. They all piled into the minivan. Chang in his usual spot behind Rebecca, clutching his flowers. Nelson sat behind Samuel. Charlie was playing on his Switch, completely healthy now from 2 years of Chang's donations. As they drove, Chang watched the streets carefully. The cemetery was coming up. He could see the gates. His parents were in Section C, row 36. He had it memorized. The cemetery's right there, Chang said softly, his flowers ready and face beaming with excitement. But Samuel didn't slow down. He drove right past it. Dad? Chang's voice turned tiny. The cemetery? We're running late, buddy. Maybe after. Chang's throat tightened, but he nodded. After would be fine. They pulled into the courthouse parking lot, and Chang's heart was pounding. This was it. 7 years of waiting. He was about to become part of a family. Until Samuel turned around in his seat. So, Chang, there's been a change of plans. The flowers slipped from his hands. What? Rebecca wouldn't look at him. We've decided to adopt Nelson instead, she said quietly. Chang couldn't breathe. But you said I was family after I saved Charlie. I gave him everything. And we're grateful, Samuel responded. But Nelson's a better fit for our family. Chang paused, starting to tear up. He looked at Nelson's perfect hair, his normal and white skin, at his healthy body. Then down at his own skeletal hands, his IV tracks, the visible scars covering him head to toe. You mean he doesn't look like a freak? He whimpered out quietly. Charlie finally looked up from his game. Yeah, Nelson looks normal. He can actually play soccer with me. I can't play soccer because I gave you my liver, Chang whisper cried, putting his head in his hands. Rebecca didn't even feel bad. She just opened the door. The social worker will find you another placement. You can wait in the car. Then they got out. All of them. Samuel, Rebecca, Charlie, and Nelson, walking toward the courthouse. Chang watched them through the window, his adoption day outfit soaked with tears. Wait! Chang scrambled out of the car, stumbling on his weak legs. Please! I'll donate more, whatever Charlie needs. They kept walking. You promised! He screamed. You promised I'd be your son! Rebecca turned around, annoyed. Chang, stop making a scene. I gave you everything! Chang screamed again. I can't have friends. I can't grow. I'll never be normal, and I did it all for you. Samuel stepped forward. Nobody forced you to donate. You volunteered. Now get back in the car. Chang collapsed on the courthouse steps, his ruined body failing him. Nelson stepped over him to get to the door. Through his tears, Chang saw them disappear inside. The family of 4. Samuel, Rebecca, Charlie, and Nelson Murphy. That's when I got the call. The social worker, asking if I wanted to take Chang in. And when she told me why he needed somewhere to stay, I was seeing red. My hands were shaking. So bad I could barely hold the phone. The social worker kept talking about emergency placement and immediate pickup, but all I heard was abandoned at the courthouse. I grabbed my keys and wallet while she gave me directions to the family court building downtown. The whole drive there, my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I kept thinking about Samuel and Rebecca just leaving him there after everything he gave them. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty by the time I arrived. Inside the waiting room was all beige walls and plastic chairs that looked like they'd been there since the 80s. Chang sat in the corner still wearing what must have been his adoption outfit. His button-up shirt was way too big for his skinny frame. The flowers he'd picked for his parents' graves were wilted in his lap. He didn't even look up when I walked in. The social worker started pushing paperwork at me right away. Emergency placement forms and medical consent, and something about temporary custody. Chang just stared at the floor while I signed everything. His hands kept gripping and releasing those dead flowers. When I finally got all the forms done, I knelt down in front of him. He looked at me with these hollow eyes and I wanted to cry. The walk to my car felt like it took forever. Chang moved so slow and careful, like every step hurt. He climbed into the passenger seat, still clutching those flowers. We drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. Then Chang started crying these quiet little sobs that broke my heart. I told him we'd go to the cemetery tomorrow if he wanted. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Adults had been breaking promises to him his whole life. At my apartment, Chang could barely make it up the stairs. He kept apologizing that he wasn't useful anymore. Each apology made me want to drive to Samuel's house and scream at him. Instead, I got Chang settled on the couch with extra pillows for his back. I found the strongest pain meds I had and got him water. He took them without asking what they were. That scared me more than anything. He was so used to just accepting whatever adults gave him. That first night was rough. Chang woke up crying from the pain at least 3 times. Each time he apologized for waking me up. I kept telling him it was okay, but he wouldn't stop saying sorry. The next morning, the social worker showed up early for our emergency intake meeting. She sat at my kitchen table with her laptop and started asking Chang questions. His answers were all one word when he answered at all. She typed up a safety plan while I made breakfast that Chang barely touched. The whole time I felt like I was evaluated. She kept watching how I talked to Chang and taking notes. Part of me understood she had to make sure I was safe. The other part wanted to tell her to focus on the people who actually hurt him. She gave me a list of doctors who took emergency cases. The first name was Harvey Torres at the Children's Hospital. I called right there and explained the situation. The receptionist said they could see us tomorrow morning for a full evaluation. My stomach twisted thinking about what they might find. Samuel called that evening while Chang was trying to eat soup. His name on my phone made my blood boil. He started talking fast about how this was all a big misunderstanding. He said Chang volunteered for everything and wanted to help Charlie. He kept saying they never forced him to do anything. I told him all contact had to go through CPS now. Then I hung up while my hands shook with rage. Chang heard the whole thing from the living room. He didn't say anything, but his shoulders got even smaller. The next morning at the clinic was hard. Dr. Torres was gentle but thorough. He documented every scar on Chang's body. There were so many I lost count. The skin graft sites on his thighs looked angry and red. His arms were covered in needle marks from all the blood draws. Chang just stood there and let the doctor examine him. He followed every instruction without question. When the doctor asked him to lift his shirt, Chang did it right away. No hesitation or complaint. That complete compliance scared me. He was so used to medical people touching him and taking from him. Dr. Torres measured Chang's height and weight and frowned at the numbers. He ordered blood work and x-rays and a bunch of other tests. Chang didn't even flinch when they drew more blood. After the appointment, I started calling hospitals for Chang's medical records. Each place had different requirements and forms. Some wanted notarized letters and others needed court orders. The whole process was a nightmare of red tape. I spent hours on hold just to be transferred to different departments. Chang sat next to me the whole time, not saying anything. That night, he finally asked the question I'd been dreading. He wanted to know if the adoption could still happen somehow. Maybe if he apologized to Samuel and Rebecca, they'd change their minds. The hope in his voice destroyed me. I had to tell him it was really over. They'd chosen Nelson and signed the papers already. Chang crumpled into himself and started sobbing. I held him while he cried and tried not to make promises I couldn't keep. All I could do was be there while his heart broke completely. The next morning, I called the school district office about getting Chang enrolled. The woman on the phone asked about his previous school records, and I had to explain he hadn't been in the school for months. She transferred me to the special services coordinator, who dealt with kids with medical needs. I spent 40 minutes going through Chang's health issues while he sat at the kitchen table picking at toast. The coordinator said they'd need documentation from his doctor before they could create an accommodation plan. She scheduled us for an intake meeting next week, but warned me Chang might need to start with half days. After I hung up, Chang asked if kids would stare at him, and I couldn't lie, so I just said we'd figure it out together. That afternoon, I called around looking for a therapist who took our insurance and had experience with medical trauma. The 5th place I tried had someone named Mara Stevens who specialized in foster kids. The receptionist said she had an opening for an intake next Tuesday. When I told Chang about it later, he got really quiet, and then asked if I'd stay with him during the session. I explained that usually therapists meet with kids alone, but he started shaking his head and backing away. He said he couldn't do it if I wasn't there. I called back, and Mara said it was fine if I stayed in the waiting room as long as Chang knew I was close by. That seemed to help, and Chang nodded when I told him. 3 days later, I kept my promise about the cemetery. Chang held those letters he'd written so tight his knuckles went white. We drove to Section C and walked down to row 36, where 2 small headstones sat side by side. Chang knelt down even though I could see it hurt his knees. He put 1 letter on each grave and then just sat there for a long time. I heard him whisper that he tried to get a family, but they didn't want him after all. He told them he was sorry he couldn't make it work. When we got back to the car, he was crying again, but it was different from before. These tears seemed less desperate and more like goodbye. The school intake meeting came faster than I expected. The coordinator had gotten Dr. Torres's reports, and her face was serious when we sat down. She said Chang would qualify for extensive accommodations, including modified PE and extra time between classes. They could start him on half days next Monday to see how he handled it. Chang agreed, even though I could see he was scared. Monday morning came, and Chang put on his new clothes that actually fit him. His hands shook as he tried to button his shirt. At the school, kids started staring the second we walked in. Some whispered to their friends and pointed at his bald spots. One girl asked loudly what was wrong with him. Chang pressed closer to me and kept his eyes on the floor. We made it through first period and part of second before Chang tugged on my sleeve. He whispered that he wanted to leave. The teacher understood when I explained we were doing half days. In the car, Chang said the staring was worse than he thought it would be. He asked if we could try again tomorrow, and I said of course. That afternoon, Dr. Torres called with Chang's latest test results. His voice was more serious than before. He said Chang showed severe malnutrition, and his hormone levels indicated significantly delayed puberty. He wanted to refer us to 3 different specialists immediately: an endocrinologist for the hormone issues, a nutritionist for weight gain, and a dermatologist for the scarring. I wrote down all the names while my hand cramped from gripping the pen so hard. Chang watched me from the couch, and I tried to keep my face calm. Dr. Torres said he was also filing his report with the state medical board about the frequency of Chang's donations. The next day, our social worker called after reviewing everything I'd sent her. She said she was opening a formal investigation into Samuel and Rebecca for neglect and exploitation. She needed me to document everything Chang told me about his time with them. I spent 3 hours typing up every detail while Chang napped on the couch. The social worker said the investigation would take several weeks, but she'd already flagged their file. That meant they couldn't take in any more foster kids while this was pending. It felt like a small victory, but not enough. Samuel started texting me that night. He said I was blowing this out of proportion, and that Chang wanted to help Charlie. He kept saying Chang volunteered for everything, and they never forced him. His messages got angrier when I didn't respond. He said I was poisoning Chang against them and threatened to call CPS on me. I showed Chang the texts and asked if he wanted to talk about it. He just stared at them and then went to his room without saying anything. I heard him crying through the door, but when I knocked, he said he wanted to be alone. The next morning, I called a family attorney named Jace Altman, who the social worker recommended. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. When I finished, he said we had strong grounds for both guardianship and a restraining order. He explained the legal process would take months and cost money I didn't really have. But he also said he'd work with me on payment plans because this case made him angry too. We scheduled a meeting for later that week. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived from one of the hospitals. Inside were partial medical records showing every donation Chang made. Weekly plasma draws for 2 years straight. Monthly skin grafts that took bigger pieces each time. 3 separate liver donations that pushed the legal limits. My hands shook as I read through the dates and procedures. Chang saw me reading them and just turned around and went to his room. He didn't come out for dinner. Tuesday arrived and we went to Chang's first real therapy appointment with Mara. She was younger than I expected, with kind eyes and a soft voice. Chang gripped my hand until she said I could wait right outside. The session was supposed to be an hour, but after 30 minutes the door opened. Mara said Chang did great for a first session. In the car, Chang told me Mara asked him to describe what happened without judging his feelings. He said she helped him understand that being pressured wasn't the same as volunteering. Then he said something that made me pull over. He looked at me and said I was used, and for the first time he didn't say it like a question. I pulled into a parking spot and turned to look at him, but his phone buzzed before I could say anything. Chang's face went white as he stared at the screen, and I saw Charlie's name at the top of a Facebook message. The message said, "You promised to help me get better," with 3 crying emojis. Chang's hands shook as he hit the block button without even reading the rest. He looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like he was surprised at himself for doing it. We sat there in silence for a minute before driving home. That night, the social worker called to tell me CPS was scheduling a family team meeting for next week. She explained it was part of the investigation process where everyone would meet to discuss Chang's case. I spent the next 3 days gathering every piece of paper I could find. Medical records from Dr. Torres, the texts from Samuel, notes from Mara's office about Chang's first session. I organized everything into a binder with tabs and made copies of everything. My kitchen table turned into a command center covered in paperwork. I barely slept those nights, going over every detail and making sure I had documentation for everything. Chang watched me working from the couch but didn't say much. On the 3rd day, another notification popped up on Chang's phone while he was doing homework. This time it was Nelson sending a message through Instagram saying he was sorry about everything that happened. Chang showed me the message and then swiped it away without opening it. He told me he was done taking care of how other people felt about what they did to him. The way he said it was so matter-of-fact, like he'd made a decision, and that was that. Money started getting tight fast with Chang living with me. I had to cut my work hours to take him to all his appointments and be home when he got back from the school. The foster care stipend application was still being processed and wouldn't come through for weeks. My savings account dropped lower every day between groceries, gas for all the medical appointments, and the co-pays that kept adding up. I started buying generic everything and skipping my own lunch to make sure Chang had what he needed. But I never said anything to him about it because he had enough to worry about. Dr. Torres called me 2 days before the family team meeting to tell me he'd filed an ethics report with the hospital board. He said the frequency of Chang's donations and the fact that he was a minor raised serious red flags about consent procedures. He couldn't promise anything would come of it, but said the board was taking it seriously. It felt good to know someone else saw how wrong this all was, but I knew hospital investigations could take months or even years. The morning of the family team meeting, I drove Chang to the school like normal. We were running a few minutes late because Chang had trouble sleeping and moved slower than usual. As I pulled up to the drop-off area, I saw Samuel standing right at the edge of school property. Chang saw him at the same time and froze in his seat. Before Samuel could take a step toward us, 2 staff members moved between him and our car. The principal came out and told Samuel he needed to leave immediately. They wrote everything down in some kind of logbook while Samuel kept trying to explain he just wanted to talk to Chang. Chang was shaking so bad I had to help him out of the car on the other side. After Samuel finally left, Chang looked at me and said he never wanted to see them or talk to them ever again. His voice was small but certain. I called Jace from the school parking lot and told him what happened. He said this was exactly what we needed to file for emergency guardianship and a restraining order. He'd been waiting for something concrete like this to strengthen our case. Within 2 hours, he had the paperwork ready and filed it with the court based on the school incident and all the threatening texts from Samuel. The fear I'd been carrying around started shifting into something more focused, like we were finally doing something instead of just reacting. The family team meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the CPS office downtown. We got there early and waited in a room with fake plants and motivational posters. Samuel and Rebecca showed up right on time with their lawyer. The CPS investigator, 2 supervisors, and someone taking notes all sat around this big conference table. Samuel started talking immediately about how Chang was a hero who wanted to save Charlie's life. He kept using words like sacrifice and noble and selfless choice, while Rebecca just stared at the table. Chang sat next to me, getting smaller and smaller in his chair with every word Samuel said. About 20 minutes in, Chang tugged on my sleeve and whispered that he needed to leave. For the first time since I'd taken him in, he was asking for what he needed instead of just enduring it. I told the room Chang needed a break, and we stepped outside. He said he couldn't listen to Samuel lie anymore about him choosing everything. We went back in just long enough for me to give our statement and hand over the binder of documentation. The investigator said they'd be in touch about next steps. 3 days later at his therapy appointment, Chang told Mara something that made her call me in. She said Chang had identified the exact moment he knew Samuel and Rebecca never really loved him. It was when they drove past the cemetery without stopping. He said that broken promise showed him he was never really their son, just a resource for Charlie. The way he explained it was so clear and logical, like he'd been putting puzzle pieces together and finally saw the whole picture. The guilt he'd been carrying around started changing into understanding about how they'd manipulated him. Jace met with us the next day to go over our options. He explained we could file a civil lawsuit against the hospital and Samuel's family for damages once the criminal investigation was done. He showed me papers with big numbers about potential settlements and medical costs. But looking at Chang barely staying awake in the chair next to me, all those legal options felt overwhelming. I told Jace our priority was keeping Chang safe right now and we could think about lawsuits later. He said that was smart and we'd focus on the guardianship hearing coming up in 2 weeks. That night, Chang couldn't sleep and kept tossing and turning in bed. Around 2 a.m., he knocked on my door and asked if he could tell the judge what really happened when we went to court. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady, and I felt proud of him for wanting to speak up, even though I worried it might be too much for him. The next morning, I called Mara, and she said she'd help Chang practice what he wanted to say. We went to her office that afternoon, and she had Chang sit in a chair facing her desk while she pretended to be the judge. Chang started out barely whispering, but after 3 practice runs, his voice got stronger, and he could get through his whole statement without stopping. He kept it simple, just explaining how Samuel and Rebecca promised to adopt him if he helped Charlie, and then broke that promise. Mara told him he was doing great, and by the 5th practice, he wasn't shaking anymore. 2 days later, the hospital compliance department called and said they needed to interview us about Chang's treatment history. I agreed, but only if Jace could be there with us. We met them at the hospital conference room where 2 administrators sat across from us with thick folders and serious faces. They asked Chang about every single donation and procedure while a woman typed everything on her laptop. Chang answered their questions calmly, telling them dates and times and which doctors did what. I watched him point to scars on his arms and explain which ones came from which procedures. The administrators kept writing notes and exchanging looks when Chang described the weekly plasma donations. Jace took his own notes and asked them pointed questions about consent forms and guardian signatures. After 2 hours, they said they'd be investigating further and would be in touch. That same week, our old neighbor from when I lived near Samuel called me out of nowhere. She said she'd heard about what happened and wanted to help. She'd seen Chang going to the clinic 3 or 4 times a week when he lived with them. She remembered how he went from a normal-looking kid to someone who could barely walk up their driveway. She wrote it all down in a statement and had it notarized at the bank. She described seeing Chang's hair fall out and watching him get thinner and weaker every month. She even had dates from her calendar when she'd offered to drive him to appointments because he looked too sick to go alone. The statement was 3 pages long and covered everything she'd witnessed over 2 years. I was scrolling through Facebook that night when I found something that made me sick. Samuel had created a fundraiser page 2 years ago with Chang's picture, and the headline, "Local Hero Boy Saves Brother's Life." The page had raised over $15,000 with updates about Chang's donations and pictures of him in the hospital beds. I showed it to Chang and his face went white. He said he never knew about the page and nobody told him they were using his pictures like that. He looked at the comments from strangers calling him brave and heroic and started crying. He said it felt like they were selling him to make money. I screenshot everything before Samuel could delete it and sent it all to Jace. The next morning, Jace called and said we needed to set firm boundaries with Samuel and Rebecca. He drafted a letter stating that all communication had to go through attorneys from now on. No phone calls, no texts, no showing up at our door. Everything in writing through proper legal channels. The letter was sent certified mail and we got the delivery confirmation 2 days later. It felt good to have that protection in place. A week later, we got the official notice that our court date was set for temporary guardianship and protective order hearings. It was scheduled for 2 weeks out at 9 a.m. on a Thursday. My stomach dropped reading the date, but we started preparing right away. Jace gave us a checklist of documents to gather and witnesses to contact. Chang got quieter as the date got closer, but he kept saying he was ready. The school called the next day to discuss Chang's support plan. They'd worked with the district to create accommodations for his health issues. He'd get extra time between classes because walking was hard for him. He could eat snacks during class to help with his blood sugar problems from the liver donations. They assigned him a buddy to help carry his books. The nurse would check on him twice a day. The counselor would meet with him weekly. They even moved all his classes to the first floor so he wouldn't have to climb stairs. Chang seemed relieved that they were helping without making a big deal about it. That weekend, Chang asked if we could go shopping for new clothes. He wanted a haircut and shoes that actually fit his feet. We went to the mall and he picked out a simple haircut. Nothing fancy, but it made him look more like a regular kid. The barber was gentle with his thin hair and didn't ask questions about the bald patches. Chang smiled at himself in the mirror for the first time since I'd taken him in. At the shoe store, he tried on 5 pairs before finding ones that didn't hurt his feet. He picked basic sneakers but treated them like they were made of gold. On the drive home, he kept looking at his reflection in the side mirror and touching his new haircut. 2 days before our court date, I got a call from Porter at the hospital ethics committee. He said they'd opened a formal review into the donor procedures documented in Chang's medical records. They were looking at whether proper protocols were followed for a minor donor. He couldn't promise any specific outcomes, but said they were taking it seriously. The investigation would take months, but at least someone was finally looking at what happened. 3 days later, Valerie called to say CPS wanted to try mediation before the court date, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly how that would go. We drove to the CPS office building where Chang gripped my hand so tight it hurt while we walked through those glass doors. Samuel and Rebecca were already in the conference room acting like they'd done nothing wrong. Valerie started explaining how mediation worked and asked if they'd consider any responsibility for Chang's condition. Samuel leaned back in his chair and said Chang chose to help Charlie because he wanted to be part of their family. Rebecca nodded along, saying they gave him a good home for 2 years, and he was better off than in his other foster placements. The mediator asked about the medical procedures, and Samuel pulled out a folder of consent forms saying everything was legal, and Chang volunteered for all of it. Chang started shaking next to me, and I squeezed his shoulder while the mediator wrote notes. They went back and forth for an hour with Samuel and Rebecca refusing to admit any wrongdoing, while Chang got smaller and smaller in his chair. The mediator finally said we'd have to let the court decide and scheduled us to leave through different exits so we wouldn't run into each other in the parking lot. That night, I found Chang crying in his room, and when I asked what was wrong, he just said he knew they'd never say sorry. The next morning, I woke up to find a folded piece of notebook paper shoved under our front door with no envelope or name on it. Inside was messy kid handwriting that just said, "I'm sorry," and nothing else. Chang looked at it for a long time, then said it was Charlie's writing from when they used to do homework together. I asked if he wanted to write back, but he shook his head and put the note in his drawer without another word. We spent the next few days getting ready for court with Chang working on his statement at the kitchen table. Jace had given him a template, but Chang wanted to write it himself, crossing out words and starting over whenever something didn't sound right. He wrote about how they said he was family, but only when he was useful, and how saying yes when you're scared of losing everything isn't really a choice. I watched him work for hours, getting every word exactly how he wanted it without making it sound dramatic or fake. He practiced reading it out loud to himself in the mirror over and over until he could say it without crying. The morning of the court hearing, my hands were shaking, so bad I could barely button my shirt. Chang put on his best clothes and we drove to the courthouse in silence except for the radio playing softly. The courtroom was smaller than I expected with wood panels and uncomfortable benches. Samuel and Rebecca were already there with their lawyer, and they didn't look at us once. Valerie presented the CPS investigation summary first, reading from her report about the medical records and the frequency of donations and the current state of Chang's health. Then it was my turn to testify, and I told them about the school incident when Samuel showed up, and all the texts and how scared Chang was all the time. The judge asked me questions about our living situation and my work schedule and how I was managing Chang's medical needs. I kept my answers short and clear, even though my heart was pounding, so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Then the judge asked to speak with Chang privately in her chambers, and my stomach twisted into knots. Chang looked at me, and I nodded, and he followed the judge and the court reporter through a side door. They were gone for 20 minutes that felt like hours. When they came back, Chang's eyes were red, but he was standing straighter than before. The judge said she'd reviewed everything and was granting me temporary guardianship, effective immediately. She ordered that any contact between Chang and his former foster family had to be supervised by CPS, while their investigation continued. Samuel's lawyer started to argue, but the judge cut him off, saying the child's safety was her primary concern. We had to sign papers and get copies and schedule follow-up dates, but all I could think was that Chang was officially mine to protect. 2 days later, Porter called to say the hospital had suspended one of the providers who'd approved Chang's donations pending their full investigation. He said it wasn't complete resolution, but it was real movement toward accountability, and they were reviewing all their consent policies for minor donors. Chang listened when I told him and just nodded, but I saw his shoulders relax a little bit. The next week, Valerie told us that CPS was requiring Samuel and Rebecca to complete mandatory caregiver education classes and would be monitoring Nelson's placement with regular home visits. It wasn't the justice I wanted, but at least someone would be watching them now. That Thursday, Chang went back to the school for his first full day using all his accommodations. The aide helped him carry his books, and he got to eat snacks during math class. And when it was time for PE, he went to art class instead. He came home with paint under his fingernails and showed me the landscape he'd started working on. His therapy appointment was the next day, and Mara had him working on reframing his thoughts about what happened. Chang had been stuck on the idea that he volunteered, but Mara helped him see that being pressured to help or lose your chance at family isn't really volunteering at all. I waited in the lobby while they talked, and when Chang came out, he looked tired but lighter somehow, like he'd put down something heavy he'd been carrying. The next morning, Chang asked if we could go back to the cemetery, and I grabbed my keys without hesitation. We drove in silence except for the radio playing softly, and Chang clutching a new letter he'd written the night before. At Section C, Row 36, he knelt down beside the 2 headstones and smoothed out the letter with shaking hands. He told them about standing up to the judge and how she listened when he explained what really happened with all those donations. His voice stayed steady, but tears rolled down his face as he placed the letter under a rock and arranged the fresh flowers I'd bought at the grocery store on our way over. He stayed there for almost an hour just talking to them about everything that had happened since the courthouse day, and I stood back giving him space while keeping watch. When we got home, there was a voicemail from Jace saying he'd started looking into whether we could get any kind of medical restitution for what Chang went through. He warned it would take months or maybe years and might not lead anywhere, but he was willing to work on it pro bono because what happened to Chang made him angry enough to fight for free. I called him back and we talked through the documentation we'd need to gather while Chang sat at the kitchen table drawing in his new sketchbook. The next week, Valerie called to say Charlie had requested a supervised meeting with Chang through CPS channels. Chang listened to me explain what Charlie wanted, and then shook his head firmly, saying he wasn't ready, and maybe wouldn't ever be ready. Valerie said that was completely his choice, and she'd document his decision in the file as him exercising appropriate boundaries. That Saturday morning, Chang surprised me by getting up early and making scrambled eggs for both of us. We sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast and talking about his art class project and which movies we might watch that weekend. Neither of us mentioned doctors or lawyers or court dates, and it felt so normal and peaceful that I wanted to freeze that moment forever. 2 weeks later, CPS sent official paperwork confirming I was approved as a permanent placement, and we could start the formal guardianship process. The stack of forms was thick enough to make my head spin, but Jace helped us work through each one methodically. Chang signed where he needed to sign, and I tried not to let him see my hands shaking with relief that this was actually happening. A month into the school year, Chang decided to write a letter to the judge about what he wanted for his future. He worked on it for 3 days, writing about wanting to stay in regular school and take art classes and not have anyone pressure him about medical stuff anymore. His handwriting was still shaky from the nerve damage, but every word was clear and strong. The judge wrote back saying she'd received his letter and would keep his wishes in mind for all future proceedings. Through all the lawyer back and forth, Samuel and Rebecca sent one brief letter, acknowledging they'd caused harm to Chang without making excuses or asking for contact. Jace read it to us first to make sure there was nothing manipulative hidden in the language, and then asked if we wanted to respond. Chang said no, and I agreed because some bridges needed to stay burned for everyone's safety. 3 months after that courthouse day, Chang had settled into weekly therapy sessions that seemed to be helping him process everything bit by bit. His school had worked out accommodations that let him participate without overwhelming his body, and he'd even made a friend in art class who didn't ask questions about his scars. The hospital Porter worked at had started implementing new consent policies for minor donors after their investigation found serious problems with how Chang's case was handled. None of it erased what happened, but each small step forward felt like progress towards something better. Chang still had nightmares sometimes, and there were days when his body hurt too much to do normal kid stuff. I still got angry when I thought about Samuel and Rebecca living their lives with Nelson while Chang dealt with permanent damage from saving Charlie. But we had routines now, like Thursday night takeout and Saturday morning cartoons and Sunday walks when Chang felt strong enough. The social worker came for monthly check-ins and always commented on how much healthier Chang looked, even though we both knew he'd never fully recover physically. His teeth were getting fixed slowly through a special medical program, and his hair was growing back in patches that made him look like a patchy puppy. Some days were harder than others, and we both had moments where everything felt too heavy to carry. But Chang was safe now, and that mattered more than anything else in the world. I really appreciate you sticking with me through all the questions and curiosity today. It means a lot to share these moments with you. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.